Vladimir Putin has never been much of a domestic politician. He does not like mingling with the people, does not care about fixing potholes or hospitals or schools. His eyes have always been turned outward. What excites him is war. What excites him is sitting at a polished table with world leaders, dividing spheres of influence, making an impression. He built his political persona as the collector of Russian lands, the man who promised to restore global respect and make Russia great again. That's the mythology. But today, let's peel away the propaganda, the fear, and the smoke of spectacle. Let's imagine something simpler. Imagine we are hiring a committee. We need a foreign policy expert, someone who can make a country strong, respected, and secure. And in walks our candidate, Vladimir Putin. Not young, but with years of experience and, as he insists, powerful connections. We sit him down and say, "All right, Mr. Putin, tell us what exactly have you accomplished in your career?" But before we dive in, let's talk about this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. On this channel, we talk about hidden systems of power. But here's one you might not think about: the invisible walls of the internet. I'll give you a personal example. I adore British nature documentaries, Earth, Big Cats, all those BBC masterpieces. But in the US, I could not access them. Then I tried Surfshark VPN. With one click, I switched my location to the UK and suddenly the doors opened. It felt like finding a secret passage in plain sight. But Surfshark is more than streaming. My favorite feature is alternative ID. It creates a brand new online persona with a fake name, disposable email, even a birth date and address. When you sign up for a site, the emails goes to your real inbox, but your personal info stays protected. No spam, no leaks, no exposure. Why does this matter? Because your digital identity is power. Surfshark helps you protect it. With unlimited devices and 24/7 support, it's the most seamless way to stay private and secure. So if you want to break through digital borders and shield your identity, go to the link below. Go to surfshark.com/Bary or use code Bary at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. And remember, Surfshark has a 30-day money-back guarantee. Take control of your online life, because freedom is not real if someone else owns your identity. Europe. For a while, Putin's effort to bind Europe to cheap pipeline gas bore fruit. Before the full-scale invasion, roughly 40% of all gas consumed in Europe came from Russia. Germany was the largest buyer, using heavily discounted Russian energy to expand its powerful manufacturing industry. Some countries, such as Austria and Slovakia, obtained 80 to 90% of their gas from Russia. That was why Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, taunted that Europe would freeze in winter, forecasting 5,000 euros per 1,000 cubic meters and pushing ruble payments. But in reality, Europe merely shifted to other providers that quickly overtook Russia and brought its share down to high teens. First, Norway became the top supplier. Then American liquefied natural gas flooded in through Germany's first floating storage and regasification unit at Wilhelmshaven that moved from idea to operation in months. European renewables surged as well. Last year, wind and solar provided almost a third of electricity. In June 2025, solar topped the EU power mix for the first time. The effect on Moscow was brutal. Gazprom posted its first annual loss in more than 2 decades, a direct consequence of losing its most lucrative market. Brussels now speaks openly of phasing out Russian gas entirely, citing the Kremlin's weaponization of energy as the reason. Gazprom's vaunted export arm, once a symbol of state power, has been reduced to a shadow of itself. Attempts to replace Europe with China aren't closing the gap. At this point, we'll look up at candidate Putin and raise an eyebrow. Excuse us? But this looks very strange. Maybe you'd like to tell us about your relationships with the former Soviet republics? Former Soviet states. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia planned to keep the newly independent states in a tight orbit using subsidies, threats, and troops. But something went wrong. The Baltics are NATO members and among the loudest voices for deterrence, hosting allied forces and hardening their borders. Ukraine, whose politics Moscow once manipulated with cheap gas, broke decisively west. EU accession talks opened, military ties with NATO deepened, and popular sentiment hardened after full-scale invasion. The 3 war years minted a new Ukrainian identity that doesn't look to Moscow for anything. Belarus was supposed to be the closest success story of integration. In reality, it's a cash sink that brings Moscow a little beyond a pliant border. Minsk's Ostrovets nuclear plant was built by Rosatom on a $10 billion Russian state loan. Their financing binds Moscow for decades with little strategic upside beyond keeping Lukashenko afloat. Since the full-scale invasion, Belarus has also relied on Russian ports for about 14 million tons of export capacity, another logistical subsidy. And even when discounts were supposed to reward loyalty, they largely benefited Minsk. Today, Belarus enjoys a 30% price cut on Russian oil and cash compensation under the tax maneuver agreement. This deal takes money out of Moscow's pocket, and Belarus invests it into refineries that compete with Russian ones. In Central Asia, leaders now hedge hard. Kazakhstan's president told Putin to his face at the St. Petersburg Forum that he would not recognize Russia's proxy republics in Ukraine. Then hosted US and EU envoys, upped trade with China, and joined new logistic routes that bypass Russia. In the past 2 years, all 5 Central Asian states reported record high trade volumes in China. Beijing inked a permanent good neighbors treaty with each of them and pushed the China Kyrgyzstan Uzbekistan railway that bypasses Russia entirely. The volumes coming from this Trans-Caspian Middle Corridor near tripled as shippers rerouted cargo away from sanctioned Russian routes. On top of that, Kyrgyzstan was added to China's renminbi clearing network, a quiet signal that future trade will clear more smoothly in yuan. The direction is clear. Central Asian states prefer China over Russia and their sovereignty over historical ties. Even the South Caucasus flipped the script. After the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh rekindled in 2023, Armenia suspended its participation in the Collective Security Treaty Organization. A bloc included Russia and its 5 allies, invited in EU monitoring mission, and began rearming with Western kit. Their foreign policy vocabulary regarding Russia shifted from security patron to security failure. Georgia remains divided, but the political fight is no longer about aligning with Moscow. It's about whether to keep an EU path. Moldova, long held hostage by Gazprom billing and Russian control over its Transnistrian territory, stopped buying Russian gas and is now negotiating EU membership. The war in Ukraine exposed Moscow's guarantee as unreliable. Neighbors responded by diversifying, inviting new partners, and, in some cases, publicly rebuking the Kremlin. Influence built on coercion evaporates when the coercer looks weak. By now, we can see our candidate's resume is looking rather shabby. But since it feels rude to throw him out of the interview, we give him one more chance. So, Mr. Putin, we say, what about Turkey and the Middle East? You did say things were going well there. Turkey and the Middle East. On paper, it was a strongman chemistry. Erdogan and Putin cutting deals on gas, grain, and guns while bashing the West. In practice, Turkey exploited Russia's weakness. The Baikar plant sold TB2 drones to Ukraine, at one point donating free airframe after a public crowdfunding drive, embedding Ankara in Kyiv's war effort both materially and symbolically. Days into the invasion, Turkey invoked the Monroe Convention and closed the straits to most warships to the belligerents, quietly blocking any Russian naval reinforcement from the Mediterranean. That single legal lever mattered more than a dozen soundbites. Turkish exports to Russia surged after Western companies left, while Ankara bought discounted Russian energy. When US sanctions pressure rose, Turkish banks pulled the plug on Russia's mere payment system and tightened compliance. Turkey brokered the Black Sea Grain Initiative alongside the UN, repeatedly extracting concessions from Moscow while publicly keeping lines open to the Kremlin. While Ukraine shut its transit in January 2025, the only remaining pipeline for Russian gas into the EU was Turkey's Turk Stream. That made Ankara the gatekeeper. That solved an immediate logistics problem for Moscow, but Turkey is using its position to extract concessions, such as deferring hundreds of millions of dollars in Gazprom payments. On top of that, Turk Stream can only transport a fraction of pre-war volumes that once crossed Ukraine. The much-touted Turkish gas hub that might relabel or pool molecules has also stalled as EU rules are moving toward tighter origin disclosure. Turkey's leadership is pragmatic. It would rather stay in the West's good graces than aid Russia, despite the public display of friendship. In the Middle East, Syria was supposed to be Russia's base for power projection, a warm water naval foothold at Tartus, an airbase at Khmeimim, a leverage with every regional capital. But Ukraine bled Moscow's bandwidth. In 2022, Russia even hauled an S-300 battery out of Syria, symbolic of priorities shifting home. Iran stepped into the vacuum with oil, credit lines, and militias. Next year, Syrian oil imports from Iran climbed again, and Tehran embedded itself economically and militarily. Israel, meanwhile, struck Iranian targets across Syria with growing intensity. Moscow neither stopped those raids nor converted its Syria role into regional leadership. Then came the largest shock, the collapse of the Assad regime in late 2024, which abandoned Iran's influence and stripped Moscow of its most visible Middle Eastern client. Russia still holds the coast and can project limited power, but it is no longer central to the region's balance. In Levantine politics, Turkey, Israel, and Iran drive events far more than Moscow. We are already staring down at the table with sour faces. It feels awkward, even embarrassing. But Putin doesn't give up. Well, I'm a good friend of Donald Trump, the United States. From the very beginning, Putin dreamed of standing toe to toe with Washington, the ultimate prize. To him, America wasn't just an adversary, it was the measuring stick. If he could force the US to treat Russia as an equal, the Soviet collapse would be avenged. We flip through the results. In cyber operations and election interference, Russia rattled nerves, yes, but it also triggered massive sanctions. the expulsion of diplomats, and a bipartisan consensus in Washington that Russia is the enemy. In fact, one of Putin's few genuine achievements was getting Republicans and Democrats who agree on almost nothing to unite against him. Even NATO, which was once described as brain dead, has been reborn with American leadership at the core. Finland and Sweden, once carefully neutral, joined the alliance. US troops rotate through Eastern Europe in larger numbers than at any point since the Cold War. Far from pushing the United States out, Putin has given Washington the perfect reason to dig deeper in. Economically, the contrast is even sharper. While Russia's GDP has shrunk under sanctions, America substitutes Russia on energy and weapons markets. Putin may brag that Russia is standing up to the US, but the numbers don't lie. Moscow has become Washington's best argument for bigger defense budgets and new military contracts. As for the much hyped friendship with Donald Trump, so far, the only tangible results were a plane trip that burned plenty of kerosene on the way to Alaska, and some boastful chatter about potential breakthroughs that never materialized. We close the folder and look at our candidate. Mr. Putin, forgive us, but this looks less like a resume and more like a cautionary tale. You set out to humble America, but instead you revived NATO, unified Washington, and turned your country into a convenient villain. Putin shifts uncomfortably, then leans forward. But wait, he insists. Have I told you about Africa? Africa. Moscow's Africa playbook mixed debt write-offs, arms, and Wagner muscle. It bought flags for parades and votes at the UN, but not loyalty. In the second Russian Africa summit in 2023 had 17 heads of state, down from 43 at the first. A public vote of limited confidence despite Kremlin promises of free grain and fresh write-offs. Russia announced $23 billion in historic debt cancellations and pledged tens of thousands of tons of grain to a handful of countries. But that is charity, not development finance. It does not build roads, power plants, or factories. The security pillar was just as flimsy. After Prigozhin's death, the Kremlin rushed to rebadge Wagner as Africa Corp and keep contracts alive in Mali and the Central African Republic. Operations continued, but the nature of the ties, security for mining rights, remained transactional. Reporting on the Ngasima gold concession in CAR shows how resource deals and paramilitary protection blur into one. In Sahel, juntas in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger severed ties with France and welcomed Russians, yet jihadist violence kept spreading. Human rights organizations and UN experts documented atrocities by Malian forces and Russian operatives, including the Mura massacre. Influence that rides on fear rather than institutions cannot stabilize a country, and clients notice. But the most important handicap is scale. Moscow's capacity to finance grand projects is limited. It has no aid agencies comparable to USA, Germany's GIZ, or EU's NDICI, and its trade investment footprint in Africa is dwarfed by China's. Leaders may accept ceremonial honors and security teams, but when they want ports, grids, and industrial parks, they turn to partners with deep pockets and predictable financing, such as China, the EU, or Gulf funds. In addition, Moscow's own behavior often undercut its speech to the global south. Quitting the Black Sea Grain Initiative triggered food price spikes and public rebukes from African officials. Later, ad hoc grain export curbs to tame Russian inflation confused buyers and set sales to competitors. Coming together, All these shortcomings and mistakes rendered Russia's effort to establish influence in Africa largely futile. We are already covering our faces with our hands, but Putin interrupts. And I've also found a strategic partner, China. China. Russia's concept of multipolarity was meant to put Beijing and Moscow on equal footing, united against the West. Instead, dependencies stacked up on China's term. Start with finance. By mid 2024, Chinese state banks tightened compliance in response to US secondary sanctions risk, freezing or rejecting payments en masse, and trapping billions of yuan in limbo for Russian firms. In 2025, barter deals returned, Chinese suppliers swapping marine engines for Russian metals at the Kazan trade fair because clearing cash had become that hard. Then the real economy. Chinese brands now account for well over half of Russia's car sales and dominate the EV niche. Meanwhile, Russian exports to China remains modest and the flagship gas pivot, the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, sits unsigned despite years of Kremlin promises. Finally, the narrative. Moscow sells no limits partnership at rallies. Chinese technocrats sell risk management. In practice, that means Chinese banks, shippers, and insurers step back when sanctions hit rises, and Chinese manufacturers demand higher margins or prepayment. The trade headline numbers look large, but the terms discounted Russian commodities for higher value Chinese goods, with payments contingent on political climate, tell who's senior. By now, it's clear. Mr. Putin has failed at absolutely everything he could. We thank the candidate, show him the door, and once we are alone, we begin to discuss what on earth just happened. Economic warfare. Moscow's foreign policy toolkit, food banks, import substitution, gas blackmail, look tough on talk shows and thin in practice. The 2014 food embargo raised prices and cut choices within Russia itself. Russian and international studies found consumers paid more and ate less variety. Import substitution delivered pockets of success in agriculture, but in industry it mostly meant delays, lower quality, and high cost. Problems that deepened as critical components vanished. State-backed reports now concede that a decade of substitution has not created competitive technology clusters. Weaponizing gas proved self-destructive. The EU replaced Russian imports with Norwegian pipeline gas, and US LNG built new terminals and accelerated clean power deployment. Reputation matters in commodities. Once buyers decide a supplier is unreliable, they lock in alternatives. That is exactly what Europe did. At the core of Russian diplomatic failures is an outdated idea that greatness equals territory and fear equals respect. Putin said the quiet part out loud in 2021, publishing an essay denying Ukraine's nationhood and framing conquest as restoration. The Ruski Mir concept extended that logic to culture and faith. Wherever Russian speakers or orthodoxy reach, so should Moscow's tutelage. In the 19th century, powers talked like this openly. In the 21st, it marks a country as unsafe and backward. The costs are visible. Diplomatically, UN votes after February 2022 isolated Russia in ways the Kremlin didn't expect. Economically, the state doubled down on extraction and armaments, starving innovation of inputs, markets, and people. Soft power collapsed, talent immigrated, brands left, and cultural reach narrowed to friendly or dependent regimes. Even military successes hold out leverage. By scaring neighbors, Russia pushed them into each other's arms and into institutions designed to contain Moscow. There is another, quieter cost. Building trust takes decades. Breaking it can take one winter. When governments, investors, and audiences decide your promises don't bind and your narratives are propaganda, the gravity field weakens. Allies become clients who bargain hard. Adversaries treat your threats as noise unless backed by force you can't afford forever. In place of respect, there is suspicion. In place of wealth, discount deals. In place of influence, dependence. The bid to revive an empire left Russia weaker and despised, boxed in by sanctions, budget strain, and a growing dependence on Beijing. The Russian world didn't expand through the war in Ukraine. Instead, it retreated from its long established markets and spheres of influence. History won't catalog Putin's legacy as statecraft. It will read as a case study in the limits of force. In the 21st century, lasting influence comes from trust, innovation, and partners who stay when pressure rises. Russia traded those for fear and short term deals. Now I want to recommend my historical novel series, Russian Treasures. It explores the first decade of Soviet power not as a dry timeline of facts, but as a living story. You'll see how the system took shape step by step, and more importantly, how it affected both ordinary people and extraordinary ones. The series is filled with unforgettable characters, each finding their own way to survive or outsmart a system determined to swallow them whole. At times tragic, at times darkly funny, but always true to history. If this video convinced you or angers you, see it with a question. Can brute force ever produce real greatness? If this helps the picture snap into focus, help one more person see it. Like the video and share it with a friend who still thinks intimidation equals influence. If you are new here, subscribe. Join the conversation. In one line, name Putin's single biggest self-owned abroad and why. Europe, the near abroad, Turkey, Middle East, the US, NATO, Africa, or China. If you want to go deeper, you can join the think tank, members QAs and research notes, buy me a coffee, donate via PayPal, or leave a super thanks. Every contribution keeps this work independent, and I'll list all Buy Me a Coffee supporters in the closing credits of this video. Thank you.